Hi, everyone. Welcome to the SAEM Advanced Research Methodology, Evaluation, and Design course online lecture titled Breaking into the NIH, Considering Early Career Research Grants. As we begin today, please write down and save any questions you may have for the end of the presentation. You can unmute yourself and ask your question or enter your question into the chat box during the Q&A portion of the lecture. This presentation is being recorded and will be emailed to you shortly following today's session. And now it is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. David Jang. Dr. Jang is a professor of emergency medicine at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine. His lab is studying the interaction of mitochondrial function in the area of acute care that includes sepsis and acute poisoning. He is currently taking a translational approach, studying the mitochondria at a cell-based level to various animal models, all the way to the clinical setting, actively enrolling patients with these acute medical conditions with the goal to develop better prognostic measures with the potential for mitochondrial-directed therapy. Dr. Jang, I will now turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks a lot, John. You can hear me okay?
Yeah, we hear you just fine.
Okay, perfect. Great. Hi, everyone. I'm glad you guys can make it today. I'm very excited to talk about this topic. In general, aside from being, very enthusiastic about research, I also love to talk to people who are sort of very interested in making a research career, because obviously, as you'll see during this talk, I've kind of went through my fair share of roadblocks and lumps and things like that. So I'm hoping that, as we sort of talk about the smaller research grants for this hour, that I'll sort of also share kind of my experiences with, getting non-discussed and, all this other stuff. So, there is light at the end of the tunnel. So, with that, honestly, I'm not going to spend the whole hour just talking at you. Just sort of like what John mentioned, as I talk about things, definitely, write down some questions, and, I'll pause after each slide or, each main point. If people want to ask questions, feel free to ask away and stuff like that. I really want this to be interactive, sort of with the Zoom age. I think it's a little bit difficult to do that. It'd be awesome if we're all in one room to be able to do that. So, but, obviously with the limitations of sort of doing this electronically. I will say there is one caveat. My 4-year-old is taking a nap right now, so he may wake up a little bit during. So I'll if in case he does, I'll probably pause for 30 seconds and scoot him downstairs, and I'll come right back up. So it might be a little interruption during. It might be a welcome interruption depending. So, so I don't really have any disclosures. Obviously a lot of my work that John sort of mentioned in the beginning is a lot of translational work, which may or may not be relevant to your interest in research. But honestly, I think you'll see as I talk about the different funding mechanisms and things like that, that it's not really the research topic per se. It's really sort of is it innovating? Is it something that, within that particular sphere of interest that you're interested in pursuing, is it different and, yada, yada, and things like that. So even though my work is mostly translational, I will use my examples just based on my own personal experience, but you could easily see how this could be applicable to what you may be interested in, whether it be, opiates, which obviously is the rage, or something that may be a little bit less germane, even within acute care research. So, don't be dissuaded, even though my research focus may be different from yours. So you can see here, most of my funding obviously is through NIH. I'll be talking about, sorry, I think someone is unmuted or not muted. Sorry, thanks. Obviously I have some experience with the R21 mechanism, and then obviously with the K grant, things like that. I think the title was the title they sort of asked me to use. It's not really about career development grants per se, being the individual K awards, but I'm happy to talk about that too as well. But I really wanted to focus on the R03, R21 mechanisms. I think that's something that a lot of people may not know about or may have just heard about. And, you can sort of see after this hour, if this is something that may be of interest to you. And obviously, even after this hour, if anyone wants to email me, whatever, I'm always happy to talk to as well. And there may be people in this room that might have experience with these other grant mechanisms too as well. So, but, I'm obviously happy to talk about other things that are sort of around that sphere, individual K awards, my experience with it, writing an R1 and things like that. So, like I said, I'm not an expert, so I'm just really talking about my experiences, as well as talking to other my colleagues who have been sort of in my same shoes as well too. So, like I said, the session is meant to be interactive. Obviously we did the introduction. If this was like more of a, big room kind of format, I would definitely, if we had the time, I would love to like kind of go around the room and see what other people are interested in. But obviously for the sake of time and just because this format doesn't particularly allow for it, we'll kind of not do that particular part. But I'll give a little bit of my background. And then really, I think the meat of this hour will be just talking about sort of the R03, R21 mechanisms, like how much do you get with it? What are, study sections looking for if you're interested in applying for it? When is the best time to apply? And obviously you guys may have other questions sort of, related to that topic too as well. And then sort of Q&A session. But, honestly, I think, as we go along, if people have like burning questions they just want to ask, definitely feel free to do so too as well. So my research topic, I'm not going to really spend like more than a minute on this, but just as John mentioned in the beginning, I'm very sort of like translationally focused. Obviously, I'm a toxicologist by training, emergency medicine, and then obviously medical toxicology fellowship. So a lot of my work really is more in acute poisoning. I've done some other sort of critical care related stuff with sepsis, but really my interest and passion is toxicology. And I do stuff from ex vivo to small animals to large animals, from rodents and pigs and stuff like that, looking at a whole host of cellular outputs and stuff like that. So. Anyway, so I wanted to give like a kind of just an overall background, just to kind of set the stage, not just for today, but also, I'm assuming most of you guys are sort of like younger investigators, and that's why you're taking the armed course. But that's sort of, something to think about as you're sort of doing this year with the different types of sessions spread out throughout the year. And, depending on where you are in your stage of training, whether you're a fellow, maybe you're on a T32, K12, KL2 or something like that, or early in your K, individual K or something like that. So these are like sort of like big sort of things to think about. So I'll kind of like go through each point because I think they're just sort of important and worth sort of mentioning. So obviously, for a successful research career, obviously you sort of have to plan ahead, like, how are you going to get to the next stepping stone? Like whether it be from like fellowship to like, a training program, then on to an individual K, R01, et cetera, et cetera. So, that's sort of like, obviously it's going to involve a lot of combination of like good mentorship, good environment, supportive department, et cetera, et cetera. You guys probably already know that. Point number two, there's a lot of like, so I remember like going to a talk called Alphabet Soup of NIH. And even though I'm saying NIH is obviously a whole host of different organizations, funding bodies, DOD, other sources of federal funding, things like that. Obviously, I'm going to focus more on sort of the NIH R03, R21, just because I think it's something that gets tossed around a lot within sort of the younger investigator sphere. So I will talk about those two. Obviously, I think, as younger investigators, the goal is R01, right? That's like sort of the, the 5-year bread and butter, gets your, time down, gives you like 5 years of support, money, it's renewable, all this other good stuff. So that's going to be the ultimate goal. Obviously, we're not going to talk about that today, per se. I mean, I'm happy to talk about my experience submitting and, getting rejected, things like that. But so obviously, while K awards and R1s are kind of like the bread and butter for like, whatever, I wanted to kind of talk about sort of the in-between grants, which I just sort of mentioned. Okay, so let's jump right into it. Before I jump into the R03, does anyone have any questions just about what I sort of mentioned or just general stuff? I'll pause for a second so I can also take a swig of my Diet Dr. Pepper. I think I can pull up the chat too. All right, nothing on the chat. All right, good. So I'll jump into the R03 mechanism. I'll kind of give the background and then give sort of my own experiences with it. And then, we can, I think, pause and then if people have questions relate more to R03. So I think the R03 mechanism is something that a lot of young investigators will sort of think about. And I think, once you hit fellowship after your primary training, I'm assuming most folks here are, either pediatrics or emergency medicine or something like that as your primary specialty. And then now maybe you're doing a fellowship or whatever. But I definitely have known like people in my department, obviously I'm over at Penn, where, they have applied for R03s before they, gotten their individual K and, they were on a T32 or a KL2 or K12. So I think it's a very nice mechanism. I'll kind of give you sort of the deets in terms of like what it is, and then kind of talk about my experiences with it, and then we can sort of talk about other things. So the 2-year award, much like the R21, unlike the individual K, which is up to 5 years, same thing with the R1 up to 5 years. Obviously, you can go between 3 and 5, depending on where you are in the stage of training and how you can justify the cost and stuff like that. It does provide. I made a little bit typo. So it's actually $100,000 in direct cost, $50,000 per year. Direct cost meaning like how much money is actually available for salary support, supplies, technician salary, things like that. So don't mind that typo. It's actually $100,000 over 2 years. The big thing I think with the R03 that the main sort of point with R03 is that it's actually for a very small self-contained project or feasibility study. So for example, if you're doing clinical research and you want to do like a secondary data analysis and you need a little bit of money to maybe fund like a part-time RA to kind of go through the data and things like that, or get some software and stuff like that, the R03 mechanism is perfect for that. I'll talk about sort of my own sort of example, sort of the lab-based sphere. In terms of the actual application, it's obviously shorter than R01 or a K. Both the R01 and the K is actually 12 pages of science. Obviously, for individual K, it's really most of that's taken up by like your career development plan and things like that. So it's actually technically 12. It could be 6 for at least it was in my case. Just talking about the actual science. And so it's a lot shorter. So in that sense, I think it's pretty good. If you think about it, it's really just for 2 years. So it's gonna be hard to write 12 pages of science just by 2 years of work, right? So that's why 6 pages. So in that sense, I think it's pretty nice. I mean, I've written a lot of sort of like 6-page research strategy kind of stuff, and I think it's nice. You have 2 aims, and it's very self-contained and stuff like that. So the big thing with the R03 also, unlike the R01, it's not renewable. So you get your R03, you do the 2 years of work, and either you use the data to apply for something bigger or something like that. But once it ends, so you can't redo it unlike an R01. So that's something to think about too as well. The thing that's sort of interesting that people may not be aware of in the room is that the R03 mechanism, meaning 2 years, 50,000 a year, 100,000 in direct costs, a lot of institutes will actually use sort of this R03 mechanism for like other things. And I actually have some experience with that too. Unfortunately, some not successful. One pertinent one that does come up, which I know SAM has definitely advertised in the past before, is NIA, which is National Institutes of Aging. They actually, which I think they kind of have been doing every year, but there is like the R03 mechanism where they will actually encourage young investigators to apply for, to basically try to get them into the aging sort of related research. So they use this as a mechanism to say, hey, if you're interested in aging research, apply for this sort of R03. There's some like stipulations from you need to have like a mentor who's funded by NIA and things like that. I know SAM in the past couple of years have had a mechanism where they can actually match that R03 if you're actually successfully funded. So I actually applied for it when I got scored, but ultimately didn't get funded. So that therefore the SAM matching didn't get funded just because it was contingent on getting actually funded from that. But that is a mechanism that is available. I still think it's available today. So that's something to think about for that too. So it's very institute specific. So let me take a step back just for folks who may not know. So at least within the NIH sort of world, there's these different institutes or institutes and centers, or ICs as we call them. As you can imagine, it's sort of like organ focused or organ based, right? NIA is aging. Natural BI is lung, heart, blood. You sort of name it, and it's sort of like they probably have something for it. So that's something to think about. So if your research is like trauma based, which is a challenge in itself, just with the trauma colleagues here over at Penn who've sort of interface with NIH, there isn't like a trauma institute. So that's what makes it a little bit difficult. And that's been the whole issue with emergency medicine, is that we're sort of like, have this sort of encompassing like, critical care or acute care focus where we kind of touch all spheres. So really, the name of the game is to find something that could kind of slot in a particular mission of an institute. For example, just using myself as an example, my focus is on cardiac physiology and blood cells as a biomarker. So obviously that's where my work fits in with an extra BI. So if you guys are interested in something where it may be related to aging, this is something to think about too as well. So let me pause here just because I think that was sort of, a lot to kind of throw out there. Does anyone have any questions just related just to the R03 mechanism in itself? And I'll give you in the next slide kind of my experiences, my examples, and sort of my feedback I've gotten from study sections and things like that. But I'll take a pause here if anyone has any questions about. I mean, you can obviously also ask after I'm done with everything in terms of the PowerPoint.
I thought maybe
okay.
Maybe, hey, maybe you could like give just besides some examples, maybe give an idea of just why should someone that's maybe like first year faculty, second year faculty, or finishing their fellowship, want to even pursue an R03 other than just having some funds? Like what's the point besides the small amount of funding it gives?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. So let me see if I can, an example. Yeah, so the question is, if you're early in your career, if you were to come to me and ask that advice, I would tell you, honestly, don't apply for the R03 mechanism. As you just sort of alluded to, the amount of money is pretty small, right? So if you're like early in your career, assuming you got like a startup as a recruitment package for faculty, or maybe you're on a KL2 or something like that, or you have actual protected time, then maybe I think it's something to consider. Sort of in my own experience, the reason why I applied for it was, and we'll touch upon this sort of my own example, is that some institutes will use the R03 mechanism as additional support for people who are already on an individual K. So that's the reason why I applied for it. And I'll kind of talk about my experiences for that. But I have a co-faculty, you may know Kid Delgado, who does a lot of research with opiates and kind of trauma-based stuff early on. He applied for R03 early in his faculty startup. We both came around the same time. We both came in a startup, so we both had protected time. So he said, "Hey, let me take something," and so he got an R03, and then eventually got his K. So in that sense, I think it worked. But if you're someone who doesn't have much in protected time, definitely I would not say this is the most bang for your buck. Use your time and resources to try to get the individual K, because really that's where you get your 75% protected time. The R03, honestly, the most support you could probably get is, without killing your budget, maybe 5–10%. I think when I applied for the R03 under the sort of for K awardees kind of mechanism, I asked for 5–10%, which was honestly a moot point, because I already had 80% with the K. So it was really mostly towards supply and stuff like that. So yeah. So I think, depending on your circumstances, I would say probably not going to be the best bang for your buck. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess one other point I would bring up to the group is that, maybe you're not quite ready to apply for a K, and you have something that fits within this 6-page scope of an R03. It would help give you more street cred in terms of getting a K if you were to prove that you had a R03. So there may still be some point, even though it's not going to really help you with salary support a ton, it does give you some additional street cred with the NIH.
Yeah, totally. You bring up a good point, and sort of what I'll bring up with the examples here is that, whenever you apply, particularly assuming most of you guys are thinking about an individual K award, obviously one of the big category components of scoring is going to be the candidate, like who you are as an investigator, right? What are your publications, and things like that. What is your training? And obviously having grant funding, even if it's like, foundation grants or institutional grants, yeah, certainly getting some type of NIH like R03, that's definitely something you could definitely talk about too, and it will definitely up your points in terms of what the reviewers will see. Absolutely, 100% agree. Yep, totally. There's a question here I'll quickly answer. So for federal money, I'll just sort of read it out. Direct funds equals money you can spend on your project and salary. That's correct. And then indirect funds equal funds that go to your institution, but not necessarily to you. Yep, exactly. Yep, that is true. Yeah, the whole like indirect, total, direct, it's, even I can't pretend to be professional on that, because it depends on the institute and things like that. So, but that is correct. Great. So let me give you an example of kind of like what I use, and you'll get a sense of like, kind of like how narrow scope the project is, which it should be, right? Because if a reviewer gets like an R03 application, it looks like you're trying to, cure cancer. I sort of jest, but if it looks like it's a very ambitious, which is like a term, like a death blow, right? If you get that word in your review, then they're going to be like, no, it just can't be done. So, this is a little bit different in the sense that for people who are currently on a K award, or who are obviously thinking about, one of the things you want to think about that's available at a lot of institutes, but not all institutes, is that they offer an R03 mechanism for K awardees. So I'll give you an example with NHLBI, because that's just where my K sits in terms of its home institute. So in the last 2 years of your K, or 2 years after your K finishes, you could actually apply for this mechanism. I was in the last 2 years of my K, so I applied for this. And it's essentially the same thing as an R03 application. The only sort of caveat is they kind of what you just mentioned before in terms of street credit, is that they sort of ask you, what is your progress on your K? Like, what papers did you get, and what grants have you applied for, and things like that. So obviously that was sort of like additional criteria they use in terms of your candidate score, in terms of like, to determine like your overall impact and things like that. So you can see over here, so like, just to take a step back, my K really was focused on very sort of like in vitro cell-based work. So it's a lot of like cultured cells, patient samples, and things like that. So it's very focused on that. So I had a little bit of animal experience with rodent models of poisoning, maybe like a couple of years prior to coming to Penn over at NYU. And so like I really wanted to merge those two together. And that's sort of what I did. I'm in a lab where we do a lot of large animal stuff with swine models. So I basically took that plus the K stuff that I've been doing and just basically merged it together, wrote up 2 aims, and just, submitted and ended up getting funded. So that's kind of like, you know, it's a very narrow project. I was going to say, I'm going to develop an animal model of CO poisoning, a large animal model, just because there isn't a lot of it. It's a lot of small animals, but not a large animal model. You can easily see how this could translate to even clinical research. Like maybe you could take some type of large database and then, you know, develop a very focused question, or maybe a different model to look at something else or extract this data. That could easily equally apply. And I know people who've gotten R03s through this mechanism using sort of that angle too as well. And, you know, honestly, you know, people say 2 to 4 aims. Obviously for an R03, I think 2 aims is more than sufficient. My, you know, R03 that I submitted was really just 2 aims. And then, you know, I sort of mentioned that I applied for an R03 through NIH, through that sort of, you know, get your foot in the door kind of thing for aging research. And I did the same thing. I, you know, submitted a 2 aim grant and ended up getting support. Unfortunately, wasn't funded. So, but, you know, that's sort of like how focused the R3 mechanism. And you can see here, these are just some examples. I think when you get the slides, later on, you can kind of go through. I'm also happy to share, like, send my grant and stuff like that. Just email me, and you know, I can send you the summary statement, stuff like that, if you guys want to, you know, put yourself to sleep. But at least I'll give you an example of kind of what they're looking for and stuff. So, does anyone have any specific questions based on the example I gave, or you know, anything else related to the R03? Because I think, yeah, we go to the R21 after.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Sorry,
Sure.
and I apologize if everyone else knows this. I don't actually know what a K is.
Perfect. Yeah, no, not a problem at all, Tim. So, yeah, that's why I think in the beginning, if I had more time, I'd love to go around the room to get a sense of who's who. So I'm not like assuming things, which I just did. Thank you for pointing that out. So, I mean, you know, honestly, I think as you know, emergency medicine, you know, I was exactly in your shoes. You know, I did emergency medicine residency at Pitt, was sort of interested in research, then did my tox fellowship at NYU, and exactly in your shoes, I was like, okay, like I heard, you know, when I was a resident, like, oh, this faculty person got a K, and I was like, what does that mean, right? So I really didn't know any of that stuff. But you know, there's like different institutional sort of like training grants, or like T32s, KL, K12. I know, like, for example, emergency medicine, you know, the big rage was, you know, like 5 or 6 years ago, NIH awarded, specifically NHOBI awarded 6 K-12 programs to 6 different institutes. Penn was one of them. That's why I ended up coming here. But ultimately, an individual K is basically just a career development grant. It's basically a 3 to 5 year investment on NIH to say, hey, you're a promising researcher, so we want to invest, you know, a lot of money, mostly into your salary, right? It's going to cover 75% of your time. Not truly, right? Because your department really foots the, it doesn't really truly cover your time, but you know, the department actually will kind of foot the other sort of end. But you know, essentially you should get 75% of buy down. So, you know, maybe working 4 to 6 shifts a month, and then the rest of that time is going to be allocated specifically towards not just doing research, but taking classes, learning different techniques, mechanisms, whatever type of research you're doing, meeting with your mentors and stuff like that. So individual K, you know, I would say for anyone who's sort of like just finishing their residency or fellowship and are interested in jumping into research, that's usually the traditional path that people often will take. They'll apply for their K. I will say, and I'm happy to talk about this a little bit later on, that, you know, they're pretty competitive. If you speak to anyone who's applied for K, I applied 4 times. So it is difficult. It's not easy. I have not yet to meet anyone who's gotten in their first time, right? Most people will apply, you know, they get dumped on by the reviewers and whatever, and then you resubmit and things like that. So yeah, so they're not easy to get, but once you get it, it's, you know, in terms of street credit, like you're sort of in the club, right? Like, you know, if you look at this success rate of those who go on to get R1s, it's pretty good. It's not like a slam dunk by any means. I've definitely known plenty of K awardees who have not converted to an R1, and unfortunately a couple who just could not convert at all, and unfortunately it sort of like, you know, didn't work out for them. So, you know, luckily there's not many stories of that, but you know, it does give you your best chance for success. It looks great for your department and things like that. I mean, I don't want to get into the whole, like, it's actually kind of a money loser and things like that for your department, but it's a big commitment on the departmental side. But for sure, like getting a K, you know, in terms of going on to get an R or 1 and stuff like that is, it increases your chance tremendously. And just like, you know, think about it, getting 5 years of like protected time as a young faculty just to kind of do what you want, but you know, to get real training with people who've kind of been through it already is pretty awesome. My own experience, you know, getting training for people who run a lab, who know how to do this and that without, you know, it's amazing. And we could talk about, hopefully you guys will have like a session just on going for a K, learning the nuances of like a good candidate statement and all this other stuff. That's like super important. So I'm glad you asked that question, Tim. Any other questions? Let's make sure we're good on time. Okay, good, 3:25, so we're doing pretty good. All right, let me jump into the R21. So the R21, I think this is a little bit interesting mechanism. You know, I'll sort of like will kind of start off and end with the fact that you know, again, if you were to ask me, hey, should I apply for an R21? I have this, you know, good 2-year idea. You know, I think a lot of people would say, you know, why not apply for an R1, right? That's often, you know, you'll read about this online and stuff like that, when people say, well, the amount of time to apply for an R1 and R21 is not that much different. Go for the R11 because clearly it's superior, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But I think, you know, I'll kind of talk about like my particular circumstances, why I decided to apply for it and how it ended up working out for me and things like that, which may apply to you guys too as well. I definitely have known other emergency medicine investigators too who have gone, who've been on Ks, get an R21 and then an R1 soon after that. One person is, you know, Megan Rainey, who I know has gotten R21 and then an R1 off her K too. She's over at Brown, does a lot of awesome research, sort of in text-based stuff to sort of mitigate teen bullying and stuff like that. So with, I'll give you like the deets with the R21. I'll kind of talk about sort of my experience and stuff like that. So the R21 is a little bit different from the R03. You get definitely way more money, which is nice. It's also for 2 years, much like the R03. It provides up to a maximum of $275K in direct costs over a 2-year period. You can kind of split it how you want. It doesn't have to be split down the middle, but you can't like put everything in 1 year. There's got to be some like, you know, reasonable division split between the 2 years. And so it's often termed, you know, exploratory high-risk research. And I'll kind of talk about sort of my examples and just hearing from others what that sort of means, right? Because you'll kind of see, particularly anyone who's experienced with NIH, when they use the word high risk exploratory research, they don't really mean high risk. They really are pretty conservative, right? They want to stay fat, like Vegas, right? They don't want to just throw all their money at something. So, you know, I'll kind of like, we'll sort of define what they mean by high risk research. In terms of prelim data, so you'll hear this word prelim data tossed, kind of thrown out a lot, particularly with like K grants, if you guys decide to apply for a K grant. So prelim data is basically, it doesn't have to be your data, right? It could be like, you could be in a large lab and take data that your colleague has used that's not been published yet as prelim data. That's perfectly acceptable. It's not considered dishonest by any means. A lot of people often will think of prelim data as data I'd have to generate. 100% not true. I have definitely used data from my mentor's work. I've used data from, you know, maybe like a postdoc and things like that. So obviously with the permission, but I don't obviously scoop it or anything like that. But so that's what prelim is. It's basically unpublished data. You know, technically if it's published, you know, some people could say you can sort of cite that as prelim data, saying that you can show feasibility and things like that. So again, it's very similar to the R03 mechanism. It's just 6 pages of science as opposed to 12 pages of science for the R01 or the K, the individual K. As I mentioned before, for the individual K, it's not really 6 pages of science because a lot of that's taken up by like your candidate and training plan and things like that. The big thing is that a lot of people often will think of R21 as a young investigator grant because they're like, oh, you know, it's like 2 years, 275. It seems like an easy grant I can go for. It's sort of like an easy layup. 100% not true. Unfortunately, if you look at the statistics, depending on which institute, I'd say 50% on average the R21s are awarded to established investigators. And you can imagine, right? They have like a very funded wet lab or dry lab, whatever it is they're doing. And they just basically, you know, throw in some data, throw in a grant and boom, you know, maybe they're going to get the R21, they kind of move on kind of stuff. So unfortunately, 50% of those who get the R21 are established investigators. So I don't want people to think that, you know, it's like for young investigators, it's definitely not true. It's not renewable, much like the R03. So once you get it and you're done with it, you're done with it. You can't like renew it like as you can with the R01, which makes the R01 pretty attractive in that sense. The other big thing I think you sort of have to realize too is maybe you have this like great 2-year project, you know, maybe you're on a T32 or whatever it is, or KL2, and you're like, oh, I have this great 2-year project. Let me just like, you know, throw into an institute. I almost did that before I checked with the actual institute. So interestingly enough, even though my case through NIHBI, they actually don't offer the R21 mechanism. So I actually, you know, saying, oh, my case through NIHBI, let me submit this to NIHBI. Luckily, I checked and they actually don't offer the R21, which would have been a total waste of my time. They're just going to send it back after 4 months and say, oh, sorry, can't do it, waste your time. So the most important thing is speak with your program official. And we'll talk about that towards the end, who the PO is. But really briefly, a program official is your contact person for a particular institute. And this is going to be the same person that you're probably going to reach out to. Say you're early in your training, you're like, oh, I have an idea for a 5-year individual K ward. You're going to, you know, find out who the PO is. You're going to like throw your aims at them and be like, oh, what do you think? You know, they'll say, oh, sounds great, send something in. Or they'll say, maybe not, but I can like refer you to someone else kind of thing. So that's sort of how the game is played, at least with over at NIH. So the PO or program official is definitely could be your best friend. There's a lot of variability in terms of how they respond to emails and things like that. I can give you some interesting stories. Again, much like the R03, different institutes can use this mechanism. to fund like something special. For example, I can give you something I just submitted like 4 months ago. So Counteract, I'm a toxicologist, so I'm not sure if anyone in the room is also a toxicologist, but there's this thing called Counteract. It's basically a special emphasis group where I'm also on their study section where they are very interested in looking at antidotes and things like that for like agents of terrorism. You know, as you can imagine, like sarin gas, cyanide, and things like that. So, you know, just recently, literally this year, they started a special R21 mechanism as opposed to 2 years. You get 3 years of funding support as an ESI, and I'll talk about an ESI, which is early stage investigator, which all of us in this room probably are, where you could apply for this. You're an early stage investigator, you have a 3-year grant, and the whole idea for them, they literally say, is that they want more investigators in their portfolio. So that's why they're offering this mechanism. And different institutes have seen across the years kind of use the same mechanism because they realize that R21 is more money. You can probably buy a little bit more of your time. You're going to get more money for supplies and stuff like that as opposed to an R03. So that's something to think about too, is that some institutes will use the R21 mechanism for something different too as well. So, so with that, let me take a pause here and see if anyone has a question. And then Joe, who is also on the call, is also an experienced researcher. We'll probably talk towards the end too as well. Is that yeah? He just mentioned sort of what I just said, that the program official or officer is the person who's going to be your main contact person, can help. And I will honestly say both my program officers at HRBI and NIEHS, which is Environmental Health Sciences, where I have my R21, where it sits at, they've been awesome. You know, they're just great for bouncing off ideas, and they're definitely an advocate. One of the things that you guys will probably hear about during your ARMED course is that if you have a score, the name of the game, let me take a step back. Once you submit a grant, right, you know, easily 50% of the grants are basically going to get chopped. They're not going to get discussed. It's just going to get moved to the not discussed pile or the ND. And I can definitely tell you I've had a fair amount of those. But there'll be half of those applications will be discussed or they'll get scored. That's really the first goal. Just get scored, get discussed. And, you know, that's awesome if that happens. And the reason why that's off, even though if it doesn't make the pay line or the cut, if you're really, really close, the PO that you establish a relationship with and likes your idea and believes in you and things like that will say, hey, you know, this is a pretty good idea. And towards the end of the year, they'll advocate, they literally will advocate for applications, say, hey, we should move this to the fund pile. And I can honestly say this has happened to me. This happened with the R03 and then the R56 that I recently got, because the R1 was like 2 points above the pay line. So they gave me an R56 out of it. R1 would have been great, but whatever, I'll take what I can get. So that's something to think about too as well. So the other example I wanted to give too is that, because I applied for an R21, kind of middle of my K. So my K actually was only for 4 years. I went on a K-12, as I mentioned early on, the NIH K-12 program at Penn, which, you know, covers you for 2 to 3 years. I was on it for 2 years. And so I got 4 plus 2 because you really only can get a total of 6 years of K support. So on my 4-year K, like halfway through, I decided to, again, you know, and you'll see this too, as you sort of get ramped up with your research, no matter what kind of research you're doing, you're definitely going to find that it'll be exponential, right? You'll develop collaborations, you'll get new data sets, new techniques, and things will sort of start to flower out. You can easily take these different ideas and maybe submit them for a grant. And that's what I did. You know, as using the R03 as an example, I wanted to develop a swine model of CO poisoning. With this R21, I was like, well, you know, I've done work with rats. I'm doing mitochondrial-directed therapy. I've done a lot of in vitro-based work. So why not take rat plus mitochondrial technique plus therapy and submit it to R21? And you can see here, I kind of taken the essence of what my K is. I'm happy to send that to anyone who wants it, where I wanted to use blood cells as a biomarker. And so, you know, I did that mostly in patients. So I wanted to kind of put it to test and say, okay, let's test this in an actual in vivo model. And so that's what I pitched as aim 1. And aim 2 is going to be sort of like, let's look at some mitochondria-directed therapy and, you know, how we can do this, yada, yada, and things like that. So, you know, I did have to resubmit this. So it took over, like, I think a year and a half to get funded. So in terms of like timing, which I think I kind of mentioned on, one of the things you want to be cognizant of, and I think is an important sort of teaching point just in grants in general, is that things take time, right? So honestly, at least within the NIH world, from the time you submit to when you get scored to potentially fund it, if you're lucky to get it on the first go around, you're looking at least a year. With the R03, it got funded, it got scored, it got within funding range and all the other stuff. It was basically a year until it actually got funded, until I actually saw the money. So with the R21 here in my individual K, I had to resubmit it, right? We call it an A1 submission when you resubmit something after you get feedback. And it took 1.75 or something like that. So it takes a lot of time. So that's another thing you want to put into consideration, is that if you're going to apply for this grant, I mean, how are you looking in about 1 or 2 years in terms of your salary, your buy down, and things like that? That's something you want to sort of like kind of put into calculations, and that is an important variable to think about too as well. So, so yeah. Any example? Oh, sorry. Any questions about the R21? There's a couple of people in our department who've also applied for an R21, and you can see here it's fairly focused, but it is a little bit high risk, right? Like, I'm using this animal model to look at blood cells, but it's not that risky, right? It's sort of like, well, it's probably going to work to some degree. The question is, to what degree, right? That's really kind of like the way I think of it. Like, you don't want to submit something where it's going to be a slam dunk. They're just going to be saying not innovating. Doesn't move the field. I've heard all those terms in my summary statement. So it's sort of like this Goldilocks of like innovating, but not so, want to kind of break the status quo. That's like another famous quote that they often like to throw around there in the summary statement. So yeah. Oh, and Joe just mentioned that they'll cover more about scores, pay lines in the fall workshop and winter workshop, which is awesome. So I won't go into too much more than that. So just not so you guys kind of will hear it from the horse's mouth later on. All right, we're doing pretty good time. So, so general tips. These are like the big things that I kind of learned from my own experience, as well as talking to others, across the 4 to 6 years of like K-12 to K, and now trying to, get the R1 and all this other stuff. So, like I think Joe kind of mentioned in the beginning, your PO, and I given examples of why they could be your greatest advocate. That's the first thing, honestly. If you have a good idea, the first thing you should do is kind of like, and you guys would probably all have some type of mentorship or maybe someone you can run things by. But an AIMS page, which I think you guys will talk about, is basically the 1-page like outline of what you're thinking is probably the best way to think of it. This is probably the one piece of paper that's going to be the most important. It really will set up the framework for everything you're going to do. I kind of given examples with the R03 and R21 where I kind of talked about like the actual aims, but like sort of built around that would be like the who cares question, the what are the gaps in this particular area, and what are you hoping to accomplish with this, and like sort of the punchline, what's the pay line, the punchline, right? Like if this gets funded, this will happen. I promise, blah blah blah, and all this other stuff. So the PO is definitely the person that you're going to talk to a lot. And I will say my experience in general has been really really good, but I have definitely talking to other folks who have not had so great experience. Maybe you send like 10 emails and they get back to you like 6 months later, and as a young investigator, you're like, I don't want to keep bugging them because I'm going to be on, part of the, I'm going to be on their shit list, right? You don't want to, like we always worry about that. I still think about that too, right? Because we're, most of us are probably like anal retentive type A researchers where we immediately respond to our emails within a day or something like that. So, if someone else is responding within a day, you're like, oh my God, like I'm not important or whatever. So, but the PO is definitely going to be the most important thing. Point 2, which I kind of illustrated before is, at least with NIH, I'm sure you'll sort of, throughout the year get, people who have different experiences with different funding mechanisms like DOD or other areas too as well, or VA, veterans, so they have their own sort of like mechanism with the merit award and career development awards and things like that. It's like very different from NIH. But at least within the NIH world, think about where you want to submit your work. I think one of the advantages, which I think could also be a disadvantage, is that for those who are in emergency medicine, is that we really do touch on different areas of different organ systems, right? Like from trauma to cardiac arrest to toxicology. You could easily spin it in a way, and the emergency medicine researchers who I know are very successful, they spend their stuff to fit within an institute. You don't have to like make it, you don't have to shoehorn it in. You could just spin it around. So it's sort of like, kind of what I brought up with my examples with blood cells and cardiac physiology, things like that, and animal models. That's obviously of interest to NHLBI, and that's where I kind of chose to focus. But also being a toxicologist, one of the things you want to think about as you kind of move on in your career is diversifying your portfolio. It's like business, right? I know nothing about money, to be honest. That's why I pay someone to manage my money. But at least in the business world, you want to diversify your high risk, your low risk sort of applications, what institute you go through and things like that. So that way you're sort of agile, right? You can respond to different funding mechanisms with different institutes. As you can see, just my 2 examples alone, you can see they're like widely different funding mechanisms depending on the institute, right? So that's something you want to think about. I don't know if maybe Joe can sort of answer here. For study section opportunities, one of the things that I was lucky enough to get involved with, and as early career researchers, you guys can look to get involved with, is they have like an early career sort of like thing where you could apply through NIH, where you could, volunteer be on a study section. Because of my toxicology experience, I've been on Counteract, which is that special emphasis program, and it's pretty awesome. Even if you just sit on it once, it gives you a whole host of like just experiences and just like thought process that reviewers, as as you're reviewing applications. And one of the great things about the, so make sure we're good on time. That's great about this is that you actually will get applications from other researchers and you get to critique them. You look at the significance, the innovation, their approach, yada, yada, yada. And you get to discuss it in like a room full of people who are very, very smart, but also have very, very, focused areas of expertise. And it's pretty awesome that you get to see people's different perspective, right? My perspective is probably very different from your perspective, et cetera, and things like that. So, and one of the great things about, being on a study section, if you have the opportunity to sit on one, is that you get to really see what sort of is the cutting edge science, right? And then I hate saying this, but you also get to see what grants are really bad and what grants are really good. Like, you used to, I always assume like being early in your shoes, like, if you're submitting from the NIH, it must be like, grade A stuff. Everyone's amazing. It's going to be super tough. I can honestly tell you, being on a study section for Counteract for the past couple of years, you get some applications you're like, whoa, like where's the quality control in that one? And you definitely get some that are like, wow, this is like amazing. And something you can sort of synthesize in your own grant writing process, right? So if you have an opportunity, you can talk to your mentors and things like that. I think it's an amazing opportunity. It's also a lot of time and things like that. Counteract meets twice a year. So we do R21s in the fall cycle, U01s and U54s and the thing. So it's a lot of time, but it's time well spent. So if you ever have an opportunity, I 100% recommend it. I definitely have known people, young investigators who are very early on in their career, even before getting individual K, who's had the opportunity to sit on a study section. And they can't, it's very valuable. I haven't heard one person say it's a bad experience. So it's also funny too, because when you see two very established investigators literally fighting over an application saying this sucks, this doesn't suck, you just sort of sit there with a popcorn, you're like, whoa, that's pretty intense. Hopefully that's not my application that they're talking about. So I already talked about point 4, which is the sort of the, Joe just put a link actually for the early career viewers. So later on, when you guys have time, just definitely click on it. You just submit a bio sketch or whatever it is. I forgot what it was, and then that's how they can potentially recruit you to be on the study section. So awesome experience. I talked about the timing thing, so I'm not going to be. Oh yeah, I'll pause.
Yeah, Dave, real quick, I was just going to mention too. Another opportunity which is low hanging fruit for anyone in terms of getting the same experience, but at the SAM level is the SAM Grants Committee does its own study sections to review for all the SAM Foundation grants. And that too is a great opportunity to have the same experience, maybe not necessarily at the same level as the NIH, but at a very, very high level itself. So yeah, encourage any of you to apply for the Grants Committee if you're interested.
Yeah, Joe's definitely right. I haven't specifically served on SAM, but I've served on the ACMT, which is American College of Medical Talks. And a lot of these, are, particularly with emergency medicine talks, they sort of try to mimic the NIH sort of style in terms of study section, reviewers, scoring and impact and all this other stuff. So it does very much mimic sort of that style, which is, great, as Joe mentioned. I think it's easy to apply. Although you could probably remind me, Joe, but I think, has it already passed in terms of applying to be on a committee for the following year? I think I submitted mine recently, so I think it might have passed already, right?
I think there was just a reminder a couple of days ago, so you may still have a few days, but not much. So
yeah,
go to the SAM website and check on volunteer for committees.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, we're obviously on the research committee, so cool. So I'm not going to beat the dead horse with point 4. I already talked about it. Point 5, salary support. As young investigators, unfortunately, medicine is money driven, and emergency medicine is no different with our own department. I'm sure as everyone else's department, it's all about the money, the bottom line. So really, it's the goal is to get your time covered. And like I said, R03 not necessarily is going to be the best use of your time, or even R21. I think for the R21, obviously since it's more money, I think I asked for maybe 20%, 20%, 10% covered by the R21, and the other 10 was covered by my K. So, but you could ask for a little bit more. But ultimately, I think, people will sort of like vary in their opinion in terms of like what constitutes enough time to cover your time for productive research. 50% is probably the most minimal, I would say. Maybe I think it's tough because when I was at NYU, the reason why I left NYU to come to the K-12 program is that I would say I was probably like maybe 75% clinical. So the rest of my time was really trying to scrap some with research. And I can tell you from my own experience that it's super tough. So, I definitely have talking to other people in your shoes who are just applying for faculty position. Maybe they're an instructor somewhere and they want, they're like talking to different institutes and they're trying to essentially bargain for like some protected time and things like that. And like how much is protected time? That's like a conversation for a different time. But just know that, time is probably the most important thing I think any young investigator can ask for. Given, choice between like salary or, getting your time covered. I think getting your time covered is important. Obviously, if you have a family, things like that's a different conversation. So point 3, 4, 5, 6. The second to last point, I think with the R03 and R21, you can easily see, and just based on like talking to other my colleagues, I think those who already had some sort of protected time, whether it be like a T32 training program, a KL2, K12 thing, or like maybe you have a recruitment package for 3 years as faculty. I think, if you already have the time and you happen to have some good ideas and you're kind of building up towards either the individual K or the R01 or whatever, then I think this is actually a good opportunity. And that's why I used my K protected opportunity to apply for the R03 and R21. And that's why it sort of ended up working out for me. And I think most of the people I've spoken to, that's been sort of that general experience too as well. So obviously this is just based on, my experience of talking with others, but, mileage may vary. And then the one thing I will mention that's sort of the last point, when you submit a grant, generally speaking, definitely within NIH, and I think a lot of other places that you apply, whether it be a foundation grant, things like that, the review requirements, right? The summary statement, as NIH call it, or the old timers will call it the pink sheet, whatever it is. So even if your application doesn't get discussed, you'll get like feedback, right? You get like, at least with the NIH, you'll get 3 reviewer comments, right? They're all gonna, what the scientific officer will do, the person who kind of sort of like, distributes applications to appropriate reviewers and things like that. They have their meeting, people make their comments and all this other stuff. He will pull together everything. And then after 4 to 6 weeks after they meet, they're going to send you back the feedback. And I think this has actually been a very good experience for me, even though, I can honestly say probably 60 to 70% of my grants have never been funded. And I think speaking with other successful researchers, that's probably the batting average, to be honest, is that the comments are awesome. If they're like, not like, some of them are just silly. There's like this, I literally have heard like near offensive comments from other people. I luckily have gotten mostly constructive feedback, but it could be stuff like, A1 is like way off the base or this or that, things like that. So is your research focus like sort of, is it like interesting? Is it innovating? Things like that. So I think that's why the feedback is important, because you could sort of like kind of like use that to kind of change your approach to different things, or maybe you could kind of go off in a different sort of direction, but still trying to maintain your overall research focus. And that's been my experience, honestly. Early on, just giving my experience with applying for K at NYU, I did mostly rodent work on calcium channel blockers. So that was like sort of my interest. I developed a dihydropyridine rodent model of amyloidine poisoning, basically, looking at therapy. And that's essentially was my K. And I was like, oh, this is great. They're going to love it. Literally, it was not discussed. Everyone's like, what's the big deal? Like, how many people in the United States actually die from calcium channel blockers? So, it really sort of opened my eyes to sort of think bigger, right? Like in my sort of small little world, I'm like, toxicology world, everyone's all about calcium channel blockers, but NIH definitely did not have interest in that. So I kind of like broadened it and really made it more about the techniques and focus. And that's how I sort of got into mitochondria as sort of like my sort of like platform, and then building off that. So that's really was all based on the reviewer comments I got. I will say when you get that non-discussed and you read the feedback and everyone gives you scores of like 6 or 7, the bigger number being not good and the lower number like 1 being awesome. I got a lot of 6s and 7s, which is like disheartening. You're just like, oh my God, am I going to give up research? But I took it to heart, went with it, and then kind of just built off that. So that's another reason to, you could think about submitting a grant, is getting good reviewer comments can definitely be very helpful. So I don't know if you had any, if you want to mention anything about that, Joe. You guys will probably already talk about that later on or something like that in the course, but yeah.
Yeah, we'll cover that more, but certainly it's a
yep.
It's wonderful learning opportunities, even when you don't get the funding, as disappointing as it may be.
Yeah. Oh yeah. If I could show you my hard drive with all the not discussed applications, it's a lot. Yeah, so I think that's pretty much what I want to talk about with R03, R21. Hopefully, this will be useful for you guys. At least, maybe it may not be the right time now, but maybe in a couple of years, when you get a bit more protected time, or you may have an interesting idea, obviously something you want to discuss with your committee or mentors or whatever it may be, that's something you can think about applying for. But just knowing that these mechanisms are out there, that different institutes or whatever may offer sort of a similar thing. Even SAM like I mentioned before, with NIH will offer like that matching 50,000, I think it's 50,000, something like that, for the R03 NIA grant if people ended up getting it. I've known some people who've gotten it. They shared their applications with me. Is like, pretty awesome. So definitely, think about these mechanisms. Feel free to email me if later on you decide maybe you want to pursue it or you just have general questions. I'm happy to send my applications and stuff like that. It might be useful. And I will say from my own experience, looking at other successful grants, which is another sort of big tip I think, is super helpful. If not necessarily the actual science of it, but maybe just the grantsmanship. Like, how do you write a grant? Where do you put the pictures? What font do you use? What margin? It's all these things that you just don't think about that do become important. That maybe that small margin of like putting the picture in the right, putting the right figure and things like that. Those small margins, may separate you from like fundable to not fundable. And I can honestly say that's been my experience for sure.
Yeah, that's great of you to offer, David. And I'll just encourage everyone to take up David on that, as well as a lot of our other faculty are very happy to share some of their
Totally, yeah.
grants. And that's often an easy way to kind of just get your head around what it means to put something like this together and do it in a rigorous manner. So that's wonderful.
Yep, awesome. So we have about 9 minutes left. If anyone has any questions or anything like that, feel free to shoot away. Hopefully this is of value to people.
I have two kind of closely related questions, and thank you for presenting this. On the subject of timing around if you think an R03 or even an individual K, particularly is an interest of yours, and particularly in the current job market situation of like the uncertainty around hiring timing, is this something you would recommend? Like if you think, okay, this might be something of an interest that you really shouldn't, I guess, should we not even be thinking about entertaining the idea until we actually have a faculty position? Because it's like a year process of applying and a lot changes in job situations in a year. So I'm just curious, like what your thoughts on that dynamic, particularly in the current job market landscape is.
Yeah, I mean, I can honestly say, just speaking from our departmental sort of experience, because we just actually recruited someone over the past couple of years, even during COVID, to basically to come on as a young investigator with the idea that they're going to apply for an individual K and stuff like that. Yeah, that's a hard question because it's going to depend on where you're applying for and things like that. But I will say, as a sort of a general catch-all thing, if you're a person who is applying for a faculty position with the idea that you want to build towards a K, and I mean faculty as in like you're going to be an assistant professor on some type of research related track, then I will say, based on my own experience as well as talking to others, you're going to need some type of what we call a recruitment package. If the person you're sort of interviewing with says, hey, yeah, sounds great, so you're going to work like 1,400 hours a year and you're going to get like $5,000 a year, that's like a no-go. You're going to fail for sure. When we mean like recruitment package, I think a lot of institutes do, like more of the research heavy institutes will do this, where they will bring you on someone who's promising, right? And I will say, honestly, I'll sort of preface this with saying that at least in our department, we've pretty much brought on young investigators, myself as well as others over the years, who've already had some sort of training. I think it's extremely difficult, at least in our department, if I haven't heard of anyone who's gone on to residency just right into being recruited as faculty. Most of them, I would say, at least in our department, have had some sort of additional training, whether it be a fellowship, a research fellowship. Like, for example, I think the last two were on the Robert Wood Johnson, I think they call it Clinical Scholars Program. And I was actually the last three recruits were all on the Clinical Scholars Program, right? They had like 2 years of like, research training, publication, sort of like ability to demonstrate that they're a proven quantity that they're going to move on and clinch their K. So that's why they ended up getting the recruitment package, which, I'll be blunt. It's basically 3 years of protected time, not 75% K time, but you definitely get significant buy down. You get money from my own, I can be pretty honest with my own experience. When I got recruited after my K-12, I had 3 years of protected time. I got a recruitment package of, I don't know, like 180,000. That's just an example. And that's very common in the PhD world, honestly. That's why, sort of like coming from a basic science sort of like research kind of thing, they offer a lot more. But that sort of gives you an idea of like, these are the ingredients you need to get your K. And that's the reason why I came on. And that's the reason why they gave me this recruitment package, was either to get the K or the R. And some people definitely go from like K-12 to R1. Like I think Bernie over at Columbia who's obviously a very successful researcher. I think he did that. I think he was on a institutional K-12 or something like that and went on just to get R1. And I definitely have known other people within over at Penn and Shop who've done the same exact thing. So you don't have to, I don't want you guys to think that you have to get an individual K to get an R1. It does increase your chances. You do get the protected time, the training to be competitive for an R1, but it's definitely not mandatory. But I think that's sort of the traditional pathway when we talk about like career trajectory and things like that. So I hope that answers your question.
Definitely, yeah. And then the second part is like in the situation, like if you, as like a junior faculty, if you are asked to, I guess, contribute to a project that's going to be somebody else's, or like as a very small scope of that project, is that viewed as, I guess, positively or negatively for your individual applications of R's or K's or vice versa?
Oh.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. So this is probably getting into the weeds a little bit too much. When you meet someone's project, like I'm assuming you mean R01 and that you're a co-investigator, so you're actually getting salary support to do some of the work, or is it like you do my work, but I'm not going to pay you? Which, trust me, I've been in that boat, so I know, and other people have been in that boat. We're like, oh, you're part of the R01, but you're actually not getting salary support. You're just doing my dirty work. But if you mean like as in like you are labeled as a co-investigator, you're getting salary support, you're doing some of the work, you're part of the publication, all that stuff, absolutely not a negative. It actually will be viewed as a positive because it shows that an established investigator, you're promising. They clearly would not have put you on as a co-investigator if they didn't think you were. It's not going to affect your thing. The only thing, which I think, again, this is sort of getting to weeds, I know Joe will probably get into this later on, is the whole idea of early stage investigator. And really briefly, from 10 years of your terminal degree or fellowship, you're basically what's called the early stage investigator, ESI. So when you go on to apply for a major grant, not an R21, R3, but an R1, you get bonus points. So my own experience is that I'm in my last year of my K, my fourth year. So I applied for an R1 last year, ended up scoring, unfortunately, 2 points above the ESI pay line, early stage investigator. So NHUBI, normally you have to get, I think, 15th percentile or better to get funded. But if you're an early stage investigator, it's actually 25th or lower percentile, which is amazing. I cannot overstate ESI in terms of like an advantage of getting your first R1. And so that's why they ended up giving me the R56 because of that. So for anyone who is like fresh out, you basically will be early stage investigator for 10 years from your last terminal degree or fellowship. So the one thing I will say, again, this is kind of, since you asked the question, is that if someone asks you to be a co-PI, you potentially could lose your early stage investigator status. You don't want to do that, but that's something you got to talk about with your mentor. I know Joe, and when you guys have your future grant workshop and stuff like that. I don't want to like get into too much technical detail, but since you sort of asked about being on someone's bigger grant and stuff like that, but it won't be viewed negatively.
I think the general rule is if you're a co-investigator, and particularly if you have any effort in terms of salary support in that project, go for it. It's win-win.
Yep, absolutely. And you get to put that in your bio sketch as your funding, right? Because you are getting funding from somewhere. And so that will go under your research support. The bio sketch obviously has changed this past year, but which I think we talked about in the workshop like 4 or 5 months ago, something like that. But yeah. So we have a couple minutes left. If anyone has like maybe one more question, just because I want to be respectful of people's time and things. I'm happy to keep talking, but I think people may have things to do or work clinical shifts or something like that. But does anyone have like another question or whatever in the last couple of minutes? And I will, as we're talking, let me type my email so you guys will have it. I'm always happy to email or talk in person or something like that. As I'm talking, type my email. Does anyone have any last burning questions or anything like that?
I'll just say thank you to you, David, for joining us and giving some info on some of these opportunities that are available through the NIH. And for the group, we're going to cover a lot more of related information on how to think about applying to these and what an application entails and how to develop studies and aims to do that. So thanks everyone for joining today. And I think our next event should be on the calendar for our workshop in a couple weeks. And so if you have any questions about the workshop or how to, or concerns about it, let me know. But otherwise, we'll see you all there on I think October 23rd, and look forward to seeing you there. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Like I said, feel free to email me anything, and if you ever want to talk, I'm always happy. We can always find time to talk and stuff like that. The one last piece of advice is that emergency medicine is a small field, and I think just as Joe mentioned, everyone is always happy to share. I definitely emailed random people who have sort of related interests just for helping. They send me a copy of the grant, and a good grant is like gold. So just for the reasons that we talked about. But anyway, feel free to email me. But otherwise, it was great to talk to you guys. And I wish you luck. Yeah, I could definitely tell you over a beer or something like that the amount of like roadblocks that I had. So thank you.
All right.
Everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Jang, for an excellent presentation. And thank you to everyone who was able to attend. Have a great day.